Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Bolt Breakdowns here on the Guilty as Charged podcast YouTube channel. My name is Alex. As always, we are here to talk about the latest news in Chargers land. Before we get to that, we are less than a week out from the NFL draft. I just saw Steven and Tyler scheduling the live stream for day one of the draft. If you were with us last year, we did day 1, 2, and 3 streams. I just led back to last year. We streamed for like 7 hours on day 3, which was a real test of all of our limits, but it was worth it for some electric reactions. I was on for the Colson pick, the Kamani Vidal pick. So it was a fun night all around. And by day 3, I think it was me, Steven, Tyler, Arjun, Katzen, we were all on. So fun show. I don't know what days or what picks I'll be on for this year. But I'm sure Steven and Tyler are making the schedule as we speak. So we'll see where the cards fall there. But if you were with us last year for draft coverage and you have been with us for the last 5 years, we've been doing the draft show now dating back to the Slater draft. It is always a really fun night, and we appreciate your guys' support. Broke a lot of viewership records last year. So, always a fun show to do. One of our favorite times of the year compared to during in season is obviously a lot of fun, but definitely our favorite part of like the off season live stream and video content with all you guys. Anyway, I want to talk in this video about Joe Hortiz. Joe Hortiz had his final pre-draft media availability. It was the first time he had spoken and taken questions from the media since the combine. It was the first time since the combine. So this was before any of the free agency stuff, all the moves that they made, all the moves they didn't make. And so Hortiz finally got up there to talk a little bit about the draft, free agency, and some questions that the media had. So wanted to point out a couple things that stuck out to me. Now, it's important to mention before we get into any of this that a GM before the draft is intentionally going to be a little bit cagey. I don't want to say lying season directly, but I do think that, it's not just going to be like, oh, I love this guy from Alabama and I like this guy from Texas, right? Like it's going to be a little bit of obfuscation as, for what positions you're going to take in what rounds, right? They're not going to answer very direct questions like that. But I do still think there's some things you can take away as well as reading between the lines on some of the quotes. And a couple of quotes where I do think they are kind of being verbatim honest. So Joe Hortiz talked about free agency and first said, you got to make smart decisions, calculated decisions, got to build your roster as deep as you can going into the draft. I think we were able to accomplish that. Obviously talked about, like the Becton signing, the Mike Williams signing, and, the Chargers, while I don't know if free agency lived up to what a lot of people's expectations were as far as landing a star receiver or, certain free agents that were on the board or the Chargers might have been in contention for, the roster was deeper. And I do think they have put themselves in a position, as Hortiz said a number of times in this press conference, to be able to take best player available at each position. A quote that stuck out to me was Hortiz talking about top 30 visits. We bring in guys that we want to get to know a little bit better. It's a fun process. We're not looking to grill them and put them under the spotlight. We just want to get to know the guy. Now, this is notable because there's been a little bit of discourse on the top 30 visits. How much do they matter? How much do they not matter? But, if they are looking for something, I think Hortiz did say specifically something medical, someone's background, right? If there's someone that they want to get to know a little bit better and they have more questions on, then they bring them in for top 30 visit. So then he was then asked about Joe Alt from last year, where Joe Alt was not brought in for a top 30 visit. And Hortiz explained we didn't have any questions on Joe Alt, and they had talked to him extensively at the combine. That came out after the draft. They talked to everyone at the combine, but particularly, obviously, when you have a good combine meeting, particularly with a player, that stuff starts leaking out, after the pick is made and stuff like that, like last year. So, they've met with, I don't know if they've used all 30 of their top visits before the deadline on Wednesday. I'm actually working on an article right now for Bolt Beat to try to capture all of the visits that they've done so far, or at least all the media reported visits that are out there, because that number is about in the 20s plus the local visits that don't count for the top 30 visits, but still guys that they met with. So I'll be putting out that article sometime today or tomorrow. Also, working on a mock draft, my final 7-round mock draft, 2,400 words I wrote and submitted on all the picks and who I do think will be the Chargers first round pick and building a mock draft around that. So that'll be coming out sometime this weekend. So keep an eye on the lookout for that. But moving on to some of the other quotes here, Hortiz talked about receiving trade interest from other teams and basically said, picking at 22, you get less calls than when you're at 5. And at this point, I don't think it's impossible for the Chargers to trade back. I kind of think if you were to pick between those options, it's probably a little bit more likely that they trade up than down. Only from the standpoint that if you have a Colston Loveland, if you have a Teteroman McMillan that starts to fall, if you have one of those skill position players that they really like as pass catchers, I could see them making like a small move up the board to beat another team to that player. That being said, I don't expect them to trade up either. I just think trading up is a little bit more comparatively likely than trading down in a draft that many teams aren't really trying to trade up in. And I expect a lot of the quarterback stuff in round 1 to be solved probably before the Chargers pick. Talked a little bit about that with Jordan Reed a few weeks ago. So I don't really know if they're in that trade down position as far as the quarterbacks either. And I think there's a lot of stuff floating around about like, oh my God, it's going to be 4 quarterbacks and Milroe and Dart are going to go. I'm still a little skeptical about that. I really do think right now that it probably will just be Ward and Shadur. But we'll see exactly where the cards fall. But I think the amount of quarterback interest is being a little bit overplayed in the media right now. Poona Ford was a big topic of conversation. So this was the first time that Hortiz had spoken on Ford, obviously. So I'll just read his full quote. This was after Popper had kind of asked him about not re-signing Ford and what went into that. Poona Ford is not alone. Again, we were active in free agency on a number of players, Poona being one of them. And in the end, it's the player's decision, where he's going to go. He made the decision to go to the Rams. I felt that we were competitive in our offers and in our pursuit of Poona. It just didn't work out for us. But we were able to pivot and add 3 more defensive linemen, which is a great opportunity. So obviously they're talking about Naquan Jones, Deshaun Hand, as well as Taylor Tart, who they were able to re-sign. So kind of moving Poona's money around to bring in more guys and fortify the depth because they couldn't re-sign Poona. Little bit of GM speak here, right? How much do you buy that their offer matched what the Rams were willing to offer, which was not that high, but it is pointing out that the Rams offer did beat what a lot of the markets thought that Poona was going to get. So, he got 3 years, 27.6, 9.2 average annual value. I believe on PFF, their projections prior to free agency, he was only projected to get somewhere between roughly like 3 and 5 million. And so when I extrapolate that and I'm trying to figure it out for the Chargers a little bit here, would it surprise me if they maybe lowballed Poona on the first offer and then came later in the process with an offer that was close to the Rams? Something like that wouldn't be crazy. Again, purely speculation. We'll probably never know the answer to this question. But I do think, this offseason does make a little bit more sense if they were able to get Poona back. But I understand ultimately kind of why they weren't. And I do think they tried. It's just a matter of what stage were they trying the hardest in? And that's a question that we'll probably never know the answer to. But this is a deep defensive tackle class, and they should be able to get an impact player fairly early in the draft within the first 4 rounds. I do think they probably take a defensive tackle to be able to replace Poona Ford and some of the production lost there between him and Morgan Fox as far as the pass rush. Chargers GM Joe Hortiz, you let the board come to you. I think that's the goal. You want to put yourself in a position on draft day to let the board come to us and take the best player. GM speak again, like, yes, every GM is the best player available GM. But I do think when you look at the construction of this roster, they are able to move in a different way than some of the Tom Telesco rosters that I can remember, right? I think back to 2021, for example, where left tackle was such a big need that like they needed to take Slater, and it worked out. But they were so desperate there that like they kind of needed something, right? 2022, kind of another example of like, you could go cornerback or you could go like left guard, but those were the two, most pressing issues on the team. They opted to take Zion because interior offensive line was a particularly big need. And you just kind of go through the years where they were always kind of taking, hey, we have this big need here. We're going to take it in the first round. And that's not to say that they didn't believe those players were best player available, but I think the roster construction kind of limited some of their options in the first round because of what they had to do in the draft, particularly early on versus Joe Alt. Look, they could have taken Malik Neighbors, they could have taken Brian Thomas and rolled with Trey Pipkins at right tackle last year. That wasn't what they wanted to do because they felt Joe Alt was their highest graded overall player, and they took him regardless and kicked Pipkins inside, right? So I do think they are a little bit more serious in their intention about building up the depth so that you don't have to take somebody. And that is something I do think Hortiz is accurate on. Hortiz was asked about DK Metcalf and Cooper Kupp pursuits. Obviously, he's not going to say anything super specific on yes or no. They did pursue those players, but basically said they made a lot of competitive offers to a lot of players when asked if the team did specifically pursue Metcalf or Cooper Kupp was the question. And so, I don't think that's surprising. We'll probably never know which guys they were specifically in on. Does seem like there was some steam to the DK Metcalf thing, or at least that was his preferred destination. Pittsburgh obviously pays a second round pick and $150 million, and it's no longer a conversation, right? But I do think they tried to definitely make an upgrade at receiver in this free agent class. And, they get Mike Will to kind of stabilize the group, but they didn't get the receiver upgrade they were looking for, which when you pivot to the draft, and we're going to have a lot of these discussions over the next week or so about when do you take the wide receiver? Is it first round, second round, third round, so on and so forth. I do think they will be taking a pass catcher within the first 3 rounds of this draft, whether that is someone like Colston Loveland early or Colston Loveland plus a wide receiver, or you miss out on the tight end sweepstakes in the first round and get a wide receiver in the second round. Any number of combinations, but I do agree that wide receiver, based off of what they've tried to do in free agency, I have to believe that one of the pass catchers in the first, second, or third round will ultimately be taken by the Chargers. And I did mock one in the second round of my mock draft coming out sometime this weekend. So we'll talk about that when the time comes, but I do believe they will be pretty aggressive in that regard. A quote that got a lot of people talking was Joe Hortiz's answer on the interior offensive line. So at first he was just kind of asked about the competitive aspect of what he expects from the offensive line post re-signing Mekhi Becton. And he said, quote, "We got better. I love Brad," talking about Bozeman. Been with him for 5 of his years in the NFL. Did a great job for us last year. Zion is working at center as well. Bradley's played left guard, Andre James has played guard. Zion has played guard, but is working at center, like I said. Trey Pipkins, has shown that he can play guard and tackle. I think it creates a great competitive environment and it really strengthens us as a whole. And he sort of just talked about, Andre James not technically getting work in games at guard in his career, but playing a lot of center and guard previously during his career where, he has gotten work at both positions due to injuries to other guys and things like that. But basically said that he was comfortable with that competition on the interior. And then Daniel Popper asked, is it enough of an improvement from last year? And basically, that was when Hortiz said, I thought we were pretty good last season. 11 wins, right? That stoked a lot of ire from the fan base, but I do think, and I talked about this with Popper in one of my bolt breakdowns from earlier this year, a specific trait of the Harbaugh-Hortiz regime, if you want to call it that, particularly Jim Harbaugh is who I think of when I think of this, but they don't throw their players under the bus. And so if they have an opportunity to do so, they're going to decline. And so particularly players that are definitely still within the confines of the team and have a potential to play and contribute, they're just not going to throw those guys under the bus, regardless of what the fan base wants. And I think a lot of NFL GMs and coaches are like that, but I think it is specifically something that is dialed into the Harbaugh mantra a little bit more than some of the other teams in the league. So to be honest, I think a lot of people took that quote as, oh, they're not taking the offensive line seriously. But I really think that quote indicates that they just don't want to throw their guys under the bus. It doesn't mean anything for the draft. They could still very well take a guard in the first 3 rounds. They could still take a guard at any point, or someone who has interior flexibility, a guard and center. No move has been prevented in the draft, as far as I'm concerned by that quote. I think that's a little smoke screeny in the sense of not Hortiz trying to lie, but Hortiz trying to say, defend his guys and, basically say, I'm not going to throw someone under the bus. So, do I think that means anything for the draft? No. Chargers GM Joe Hortiz talked about certain positions in the class and what the strategy is as far as depth of positions in the class. He said he pointed out Tarheeb and how deep the DB class in particular was last year, but they had Tarheeb graded really high, but knew he would be available later. So that was an example Hortiz specifically brought up of you can wait on a certain position in the draft and get your guy later if there's someone that you're really interested in. And Tarheeb was the guy he picked there. He also mentioned talking to players about players in this draft. I thought this was a little bit interesting, but the quote was, I can talk to Ladd or Joe, talking about McConkey and Alt, and talk to players that they played with, talk about players they played with. They're not going to sell their friend or former teammate if they don't believe they belong here. So did he ask Justin Herbert about Patrick Herbert? I don't know. But it basically saying, I thought it was pretty interesting to hear, hey, what do you think about this guy that you played with in college? And he even kind of brought up the example of, hey, we're thinking about bringing this guy in as a free agent. You played with him 2 years ago. What do you think? Right. And so I think it's interesting to kind of go through, player feedback like that. We hear a lot of stuff that is along the lines of like, oh, did they consult Justin Herbert on this decision? Or the Bengals example, right? Did they consult Joe Burrow when they drafted Jamar Chase, right? Things like that. But I think even on a more micro level, when it's just like, hey, I heard this character thing about this guy. What do you think about this guy, right? I think that's a useful resource to have in that regard. Ortiz talked about character. So this was obviously a thing in the Tom Telesco Notre Dame days, where they took a lot of high character guys, so to speak. But Ortiz also said, if we have 2 guys dead even, I'm going to take the better person. That's the tiebreaker. So I do think they will be weighing character concerns when it comes to certain players in this draft. There are specific names that you can talk about, Mike Green, Walter Nolan, some of those first-round character concerns, but as well as other players throughout the draft, not just those 2 that are kind of publicly known, but as well as some of the other players in this class down the board that maybe we don't even know about their character concerns because they're not as publicly reported on. I wanted to talk about this quote regarding wideouts because I thought this was pretty interesting. And I talked a little bit about this with Trevor Sikkema last week. We talked about Emeka Egbuka and the idea of, can you take a guy who mostly played the slot in college? You have Ladd, you want Ladd to play the slot. can you have both of those guys kind of on the field at the same time? So I'm going to read the full quote from Hortiz when he was kind of asked about size. Popper asked about particularly size at receiver. And then basically Hortiz went into this answer about what he expects out of a receiver in terms of projecting a player to play the outside, projecting a player to play the slot, or projecting a guy at any point on the field. So he said, specifically with wideouts, you mentioned size. Okay, he may not be big, but can he separate on the outside, the vertical stem? Can he track a football? When you talk about outside receiver, yeah, he gives up some size, but he can run by people. Their ability to get open, catch the football, same thing with slot players. There's plenty of slots that have come into this league and have done well outside. There's one that's one of the highest paid players in this league that everyone questioned whether he could play outside, and he's done all right. Won't mention names. I think it was very obvious he was talking about Justin Jefferson there. So he didn't say that himself, but Justin Jefferson was a guy that I remember people talking about some of the slot outside concerns very infamously. Remember the Eagles drafting Jalen Reagor over Justin Jefferson. But anyway, it worked out in the end, I guess. But then his final quote was, it comes down to playmaking, production, ball skill, separation, size. They come in all shapes and sizes. So I thought that was interesting just because our discussion, I think, has been a little bit binary in terms of thinking that the Chargers do need a guy that is a prototypical X receiver. I'm even privy to this in my mock drafts where it's like, if I have two receivers graded kind of evenly, but one is your 6'3" X receiver, one is your 6 foot, more Z, if you want to call it that, right? Then you can go with the guy that, and this is like, if you have them tied, go with the guy that has more of the prototypical like physical advantages. But I really don't think the Chargers view it that way. By drafting Ladd last year, obviously, I think they value more things than that, right? We saw the Ravens obviously draft Zay Flowers a couple of years ago, despite some of like the size concerns with him. And I think if there's a player that, is thought to be slot only or is questioned on the basis of his size, a couple names that come to mind are somebody like Golden, who obviously, is not the biggest outside receiver. Egbuka can play the outside a little bit, but has some size questions, right? Kyle Williams from Washington State also comes to mind in the sense of a guy that played outside receiver in college, but because of his physical traits, maybe is thought to be more of a slot in the NFL. I really do think they'll be open to some of those guys in a way that is relevant to what they're trying to do as far as team building here. And if they feel like, hey, we can put Ladd on the outside a little bit, we have the faith to do that. We can put this guy in the slot. We can put, Ladd in the slot and this guy outside. If they really favor a guy over another, I don't think they're going to let the slot outside definitions necessarily perturb them from drafting someone, right? I think it's a little bit of a different conversation when you talk about someone like Keenan Allen, for example, who is probably better suited for the slot in his career at this point than he is for the outside versus a younger receiver, right? Just because you transition a lot of older players to the slot. Cooper Kupp is an example of this, playing, an increasing amount of slot snaps as he gets older in his career, which I assume is kind of the plan in Seattle to a degree. Obviously, they have JSN there, so that's again an example of not necessarily the easiest fit, but take the talent over necessarily the slot outside designations and figure out that part later if you really believe in a guy to that extent. And then the last thing that I thought was notable was Hortiz was asked about Asante Samuel Jr. Potentially returning in free agency, and he went as far as to say, that's Asante's conversation, not mine. I don't know what happened in this Asante Samuel Jr. debacle. It's not very, very obvious he's not coming back, to be clear. But there's just something missing here about the storyline. I know Asante obviously came to his locker on Baggy Day and said something, to the akin of the shoulder stinger that being an issue that's bugged him, throughout his career, throughout growing up. And that was the reason that, he decided to, that not that he chose not to play again, but that was the reason he could not play the rest of the season. There's something that we're not being told here as far as what went down between Asante and the team. And obviously they're choosing to move on from him. We'll see where he lands in free agency, probably as a guy that will sign after the draft with all the comp pick stuff and stuff like that. But anytime Hortiz and Harbaugh are asked about it, it doesn't necessarily turn into like they get inflamed about a player or they get upset or they get mad, but you could just feel something is a little bit different when they talk about said player. So in the interest of honesty, I just feel like saying, I have no idea about what happened in the locker room, if there was anything off the field, so on and so forth. But the way that they have handled the ASJ thing, I always thought was a little bit weird. And there's just a piece of it that we're not seeing. Doesn't matter anymore. He's not on the team. And they're moving forward at cornerback. But that was a quote that stuck out to me. And we'll see where ASJ winds up in free agency. But that'll do it for me. Again, stay tuned to the draft next week. We have a lot of stuff to talk about as far as all 3 days of the draft, all coverage. I'll be doing a lot of stuff on Bolt Beat. I just finished one of my final exams, so I'm excited about that, and I'll be able to go full steam ahead towards the draft next week. Very excited. Like I said, final mock draft coming out shortly, sometime Saturday or Sunday this weekend that I wrote up for Bolt Beat. And as always, thank you guys for watching. Happy draft week, and as always, Bolt up.